Everybody, and welcome to my review for the Netflix series On My Block. So I'm actually going to start by talking about some of the things I did not like in this first season of On My Block. And one of the first things that comes across my mind personally is the dialogue in the show. So if you watched any of my earlier reviews of movies or TV shows, you know that I'm a big proponent for good dialogue in today's entertainment and media landscape, because I've seen it's really rare to see really well written dialogue nowadays. And On My Block is one of those TV shows that has really bad / weak dialogue. Now, what do I mean by this exactly, or in terms or in context of the show? For me personally, I felt that On My Block, in terms of its dialogue, was not able to convey its emotions in a way that didn't feel on the nose. They often use dialogue as a tool in the show to get across difficult emotions or themes. And that, for me, felt a little bit forced. A lot of the dialogue in this show, when they wrote it down, comes off as very, very forced when it really shouldn't, because these are such natural situations, and everything in the screenplay is so well written, and we'll get into that a little bit later, that with such a well-written screenplay, when you put the dialogue that was written for the show, it doesn't match, because it's so weak and forced compared to the very strong and natural screenplay of this first season. So for me, the dialogue fell really short in this season. Another thing that I didn't quite like about On My Block is the TV show's pacing. And I don't necessarily mean within the episode every time. I more mean between episodes. For me personally, a lot of the time jumps that this show takes don't feel very natural. It often feels like they're trying to, build up some sort of suspense, either emotional or plot-based or something, but it feels very inorganic, the way that they construct the pacing of the show. And again, this isn't necessarily a, inside the episode problem. This is more of a episode to episode, I don't like where one episode ends and the other one starts kind of a problem. That said, there are pacing issues within the episodes themselves as well. But for me personally, I felt like the way that they decided to pace these episodes out over a span of the number of episodes that they had, and the way where they often decided to start or stop a certain episode, was kind of jarring sometimes. So for me, that didn't work in terms of episode to episode. When it comes to within the episode, sometimes it feels like the show's a bit disjointed, and that's not necessarily any fault of the creators or the writers. I'll get into this a little bit later when I talk about the screenplay. The show has a lot to pack in, but sometimes that comes off as being a little bit disjointed. So overall, for me, the pacing was a little bit unnatural, a little bit jarring, whether it be episode to episode or within the episode. Doesn't matter. Overall, I kept feeling like the pacing was very, very uneven, very scattered throughout the entire season of the show. And that brings me kind of to my last big final criticism of this show, and that is with some of the performances. Now, to be fair and to be clear, I don't think any of the performances in the show are terrible. Some of the performances that I'm going to list out in my criticism part of the video are just some of the performances that I felt didn't quite live up to the script as much as I would have personally liked to see, and also didn't quite live up to, or kind of paled in comparison to some of the better performers in the show. And those three performances were by Diego Tinoco, and also Sierra Capri, as well as Brett Gray. Now, these are three of the main characters in the season. And again, their performances weren't necessarily bad, but they felt a little bit amateur to me sometimes. It felt like they weren't able to emote necessarily as well as some of the other performers in the show. And you could kind of see a lack of acting experience in this season from these three actors. I think that they did the best that they could, and they've done a mostly good job, but in context of the show, when you have a script, or a screenplay I should say, that is so strong, these performances just weren't up to the cut for me personally. Again, not horrible performances. I would say they were actually pretty believable as their characters, but you could kind of see that inexperience coming up from some of their acting. They weren't necessarily natural actors as some of the other actors in this season are, and I'll get to some of those actors later on in my positive aspects of the show. So that was just kind of my three actors that I didn't necessarily feel were cut out for the script necessarily. But overall, not terrible performances, just slightly more amateur than some of their other performers in the show, and I think in comparison to the script. And so now, with all my negative criticisms about On My Blog out of the way, let's talk about the positives of the show, because there's so many to talk about. And I'm going to start by talking about one of the greatest positives of the show, which is the great performances in the show. We have some amateur performances, but we also have some great performances. And three that I would particularly like to highlight are those by Ronni, Julio Macias, and Jason Genao. I'm sorry if I butchered any of those names, but these are three great performers who really live up to the script. Particularly Jason Genao. His comedic timing in the show is so good and so excellent. I found myself laughing even when the dialogue wasn't quite that funny, just by his great ability to express himself and emote in an excellent way. Julio Macias is so commanding in his personality and the context of the show. He's one to look out for. And Ronni, she brings such a natural ability of acting to the season that I really, really appreciated. So these were three great performances in the show. And in general, all of the characters, even the ones that have, amateur performers kind of portraying them, or at least their performances were amateur, they're all very, very likable characters, and that's one of the greatest strengths of this show, is that the characters are very, very well written, and so is the chemistry between them, the relationship between them. Even if it sometimes feels like it's a little bit forced and on the nose, which it does occasionally, for the most part, you really believe the friendships between all these characters. And at first, yes, it does feel forced, and then eventually you kind of get used to these characters and begin to not only appreciate them, but also kind of realize not only their shortcomings, but also their strengths. Overall, very, very, well-written characters. I was so pleased to see this in the show, how well-written and rounded out the characters were, even if, even with all the other criticisms that I've said before, still the characters really, shine out in this series. So now it's finally time to talk about one of the things that I've been talking about constantly through my videos so far, and that is the very strong screenplay or teleplay of this show. Because in this show, you honestly have a lot of different subplots, tones, and themes in this one season. And a lot of them are very diverse and very contrasting from one another. And yet the writers of the show were so expertly and intelligently able to bring it all to coherency that this really is one of the most ambitious shows that I've seen recently. It's very ambitious with what it's able to do with its writing, because it would be very difficult for an inexperienced writer to bring together so many elements and bring it into such coherency, and yet the writers on my block make it work somehow. Despite the fact that, there's so much going on in this one show with so many themes, tones, plots, subplots, characters, all coming together is something remarkable. It all comes together very, very well. And that's kind of, sometimes though, it does make the show feel disjointed, as I said, in the pacing, as I said before. But overall, I would say that, the coherency, there's more coherency than there is necessarily disjointed scenes in the show. So overall, for me, they take a lot of risks in the show and they make it work almost every single time. So hats off to the writers of the show. Really well done job. A couple of other small things that I really liked about On My Block are their title cards in front of each episode. They did a really good job of designing those, and I've been noticing a really good trend towards creating excellent title cards and in great typography. First time I noticed was actually in Everything Sucks. They did a really good job too, but On My Block actually has also done a very good job. So hats off for the title cards in the show. And also the soundtrack of the show. There's an excellent soundtrack to the show. Look it up if you haven't already, or actually go see the show, because I feel the soundtrack really matches with the show itself. So excellent soundtrack in the show as well. And overall, I really did enjoy On My Block. It has its weaknesses for sure, and not all of it works all the time. But I'd say most of it works, and most of it comes together in a way that's really, really satisfying. And it's one of those shows that you're going to want a season 2 for as well. And very ambitious, of course, as I said earlier, because especially in terms of its writing, to have so many different things come together in one show and it still doesn't feel like it's scattered or all over the place for the most part, that's something, honestly, that very few writers can do. So really well done job overall. I enjoyed On My Block, and I highly suggest you guys check this one out. This one is another one that I feel is not getting enough attention. I said that about Everything Sucks as well, but this one seems to be getting even less attention than that one. And I think this one also deserves your attention. So be sure to check this one out. I'm going to give this show a B. I definitely do want to see a season 2. That said, the show has its shortcomings, but for the most part, it does work. Highly suggest you check it out. And that's all I got for you guys today. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, do all those great things, and I'll see you guys next time.